Hello, it is my deep pleasure to welcome Cyril O'Regan, the Catherine F. Huisking Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. I don't think he needs much of an introduction, as Cyril is very well known for his work on Hegel. Indeed, he burst on this scene in 1994 with his now almost classic text, Heterodox Hegel, which was very well received, but I think it did perhaps scandalize a little bit some of our pious Hegelians out there. But they knew that they had to answer to it, to say the least. He's also very famous for his work on Gnostic return. So he's writing indeed a whole series, which arguably could be said to be his life work on Gnostic return. And in 2014, we saw the appearance of the Anatomy of Misremembering, Volume 1, that is, on von Balthasar's engagement with Hegel. The Anatomy of Misremembering is no doubt my favorite text of Cyril's. This is not to denigrate any of the other texts, but I do see it as his magnum opus. And I think the whole world, at least the academic world, is waiting in great anticipation for the publication of the second volume, which will have to do with von Balthasar and Heidegger. So Cyril, it is a great pleasure to welcome you here in this interview, to just say a few words about our conference that we're putting on here at St. Patrick's Pontifical University, namely the future of Christian thinking. Thank you so much for joining us, Cyril.
Thank you very much. Let me just say a couple of things, and a couple of things, of course, will be further elaborated, so that will seem like more than a couple of things. But I do want to begin sort of by talking about Christian philosophy. I take it to be timely, in fact, very timely indeed, or sort of to say that very timely to seize the moment, intellectual moment, regarding talking about Christian philosophy, or better, to allow the moment to seize us regarding talking about Christian philosophy, which I take it to be, at least among other things, speaking to the impress that Christianity can have, perhaps always has had, on the sapiential discourse of philosophy, fated to negotiate the present and the past. I have a particularly eschatological, if not apocalyptic, view of the essence of Christianity. And so therefore, sort of Christianity sort of always functions to me sort of as in primarily sort of an intense relationship sort of that prioritizes the future. I do think, with respect to that particular term, I also tend to think not merely eschatologically, but apocalyptically, in the sense that it might sort of be time sort of to find the strong man Heidegger, who has pulled these things entirely apart, or who has actually sort of designated a Christian philosophy as an oxymoron. Heidegger, of course, is not the only modern philosopher who has tended to segregate and to make sure that any sort of connection or conjugation of the relationship is denigrated. I take it we can begin sort of to start, or in fact, modern philosophy gets a real impetus with respect to that in the Enlightenment, and it gets sort of a kind of prudential and initially classical form of separation in constant strife for the faculties. So what do I think is going on sort of in this conference? Well, what I think is going on in this conference is a repetition of a conjugation which itself has a history, itself has a modern history. I want to say that, among other things, at least, this conference, and certainly sort of once I look sort of at the participants, looks like it's going to be sort of a repetition of, a memorial of, that debate that concerned Christian philosophy and Jules le Maritain in the 1930s, the more or less then contemporary bringing together philosophy and theology and Shivara with extensions down the line to Sievert and Ulrich, the theological turn in phenomenology, largely French, that includes luminaries such as Marion Lacoste, Chrétien, and Fabre, but also one has to reckon with William Desmond and radical orthodoxy. It seems to me the Maynooth Conference represents a non-identical repetition of these forerunners, but it also distinguishes itself not merely by being situated in an unrepeatable moment that specifies this conference as a need, a philosophical need, probably sort of unfortunately echoing Heidegger here. But I take it so that it's going to distinguish itself by an unmatched methodological inclusiveness that includes all the above modes and adds analytic Thomism and forms of thinking that bear relation to phenomenology, but exceed it in a metaphysical direction and genealogical forms of thought. I take it sort of that the aim of the conference is, among other things, to be more exploratory than probative in tone, and more programmatic and missionary than a once-off conference. Nonetheless, or perhaps even especially because, as programmatic and as missionary, I would say this conference is a thrilling start. There is an extraordinary array of local and international talent at the conference, indeed the talent level across all ranks, senior, middle, sort of and junior, none greater than which can be thought. It is not unreasonable to hope that the belonging together of philosophy and theology will come into full as well as clear view. The second thing I'd like to talk to is the appropriateness of the initiative in Ireland and Maynooth in particular. Addressing the topic of relation between philosophy and theology in Ireland is also, in my view, a moment of redress on the Irish intellectual and academic landscape, in which over the past 50 years or so, the autonomy of philosophy was wrested and secured from a perceived neo-Thomistic misprisioning in which philosophy was a servile partner, continually dictated to. The resulting phenomenon, however, was something of a belated enlightenment, in which not only the bonds between philosophy and theology were severed, and philosophy emancipated to do its business, but it seems sort of in this act of liberation, the very prospect of a relationship in which philosophy and theology can imprint on the other was effectively denied. If the conference represents a prospect of return, it does not represent a return to the status quo, but I would say a return to the original, of genuine possibility of conversation between discourses across intervening reaction formation of aggressive separation. As an Irish person myself, I feel the conference to be a moment of redress in which existentially I return home in a kind of Ulysses kind of moment that I lived through, the demise of the neo-Thomistic compressing and the rebelling, in which the victorious party announced that the autonomy of philosophy could only be maintained by the foreclosing of relation between discourses. The denunciation of an unthinking blending of discourses unhappily gave way to unthinking assumptions about the necessity of alienation. It is also fitting, in my view, that the conference is being held at Pontifical University at Maynooth. That Maynooth is the home expresses well what we are talking about, that we're talking about a Catholic, capital C, as well as a lowercase Catholic locus for the conversation, and that it is the philosophy department that the self-images different form of bringing together philosophy and theology, that is reaching to the other branch, or perhaps erstwhile stem, represents, in my view, a kind of form of healing from the pathologies consequent to the separation. It is only right that, as I say this, that I give thanks to the organizers who have a holistic vision with respect to which the respect to which this conference represents a first installment and also indicates or exhibits an energy and commitment to carry this vision forward into the future. I'm supposing that there's no accident, though the happening is happening in Ireland, at Pontifical University, that the non-Irish philosophers, including the one I'm talking to, but also the chair of the philosophy department, Philip Rosamond, is functioning sort of as something like an advanced brigade. Religious philosophers from the West, from the USA, from the future, are initiating a revival of Christian philosophy in Ireland, where one might have thought that the connection could or should never have been broken. I suppose if I'm going to be allowed to get lyrical, so let me make a third point. The future of Christian philosophy is in some sense a thinking of philosophy as a thinking of the future, or even as a trespass of the future. Christian, the adjective that's qualifying sort of the noun here, I would want to suggest, as part of how we understand the belonging of philosophy and theology together, enables rather than forecloses thinking. Not only does it give philosophy something to think, something rather large to think, revelation, but I also want to suggest it supplies it with the energy to think that comes only when the future is exposed. Perhaps I could say more about this, but perhaps sort of I might just continue to be enigmatic and leave that hope. Would you like sort of to, I am prepared to talk about the talk I'm going to give and the background of that particular talk, and perhaps that sort of would be where I should go now.
Well, firstly, Cyril, thank you for that magnificent overview, both of the landscape of Christian discourse in general and Christian discourse in the specifics of the Irish context, and looking at indeed different stages of the neo-scholastic sort of mechanistic enslavement of philosophy to theology that had its history. And then, as you said, that moment of seeming exaltative emancipation in which philosophy can then become autonomous. And yet both approaches are, I would say, equally impoverished insofar as neither realize the magnificent poverty which is philosophy understood in a Christian sense. So you no doubt that these topics are going to be vibrantly exposed and discussed as we try to open a new chapter here at the philosophy faculty at St. Patrick's College, and a chapter in which there is, to use one of Desmond's favorite words, a porosity between the theological and the philosophical, and indeed metaphysical. So your voice is, as already heard today, as a kind of prefigurement of what is to come, is one of the most beautiful, powerful, and welcoming voices that we have out there. So I just can't wait to see the full exposition of your paper. So we should turn to at least a sort of sneak preview. The topic, or rather the title that we have, Cyril, is Catholicism and Heidegger's Apocalyptic Double Bind. So could you leave the audience, if you already haven't whetted their appetite, could you, which you have no doubt, could you do so even more by giving us a sneak preview of what it is that you plan on speaking about?
Sure. So it's fairly well known that I am a practitioner, at least among other things, of genealogical discourse. And you already introduced me as someone who's writing a number of volumes on Gnostic return and modernity. that obviously sort of goes sort of with volume 1 and volume 2 of that, but it also occurs or recurs in Anatomy of Misremembering, sort of volume 1, where by sort of my proxy, or at least that Balthasar is both my subject and my proxy in anatomy. And at least as sort of my proxy, he is someone sort of who aids and abets a kind of genealogical description of Hegel, as in the last instance that we had sort of kind of Neoplatonic sort of interest and other kinds of interest in the last and final analysis, that the discourse seems to have sort of those narrative properties that we find sort of are condemned sort of way back sort of in the 2nd century and the 3rd century. That is sort of that we really are talking about the return of Gnosticism and modernity. I say that by way of contrast sort of with how sort of the analysis of Heidegger is going to turn out. So the two things sort of to take account of. That is, on the one hand, I feel I need a different genealogical category. And the genealogical category that I need is Marcionism. Marcionism functions differently. That is, Marcionism functions by subtraction. That is, if Hegel functions like a Gnostic, that is, he has to have all of the Christian narrative, and then sort of he has to have a larger narrative within which he encapsulates it and which he transforms it. Marcionism, just as an ancient Marcionism, functions as a textual, first of all, as a textual subtraction of the biblical text. In theology, it functions as subtraction insofar as the emphasis will be entirely sort of on nature of redemption, however that redemption sort of is going to get interpreted and so forth. So large parts of what would be of interest to Christians, like a doctrine of creation, a doctrine of judgment, whether there are any sort of rules or moral rules to be obeyed and so forth, all those sort of are going to be excised. Whether there's any tradition also that will be excised. There will be sort of a moment sort of disclosure, whether we think about this properly as revelation or not, in which sort of the Savior sort of comes, or at least sort of the Savior is promised to come, and there's going to be an alteration, either sort of in our ontological metaphysical state, or sort of in our consciousness. So, one of the things I want to do with respect to, at least will be the background of this paper, is to, first of all, to just take it for granted that Heidegger everywhere, before the Kehre, after the Kehre, is negotiating with Christianity. And that sometimes sort of he is negotiating sort of in good faith, mostly he's negotiating sort of in bad faith, and he's purloining, sort of he is correcting, reducing, and at the same time then suggesting that his discourse sort of is an alternate discourse, almost as if he starts out relating his discourse to Christianity and then sort of denying that he's ever related it to Christianity. So he's caught sort of in that kind of, I think, dialectic. I want to say that in terms of him only focusing sort of on not necessarily the nature of his discourse, but his posture really Christianity, the posture is a Marcionite posture. And therefore, sort of any analysis I'm doing these days will relate to sort of what I really am going to be doing or have done, sort of, but have to clean up, is Anatomy Volume 2, sort of, where I will make that case among other kinds of things that I'll be saying about Heidegger. What I haven't spoken thus far about is the apocalyptic double bind. And the first thing to do is how do I parse the term apocalyptic, and why is it double? Well, the double bind, the doubleness sort of apocalyptic here has got to do with that Heidegger's discourse throughout, that is, irrespective of whether we're talking sort of about the earlier or we're talking about the later, and however sort of we want sort of to parse what we mean by earlier and later. That is, whether we want to say the early Heidegger is phenomenological and the later so Heidegger is mythic, or etc., or whether we want to think that the phenomenological project is continuous, sort of, but so it's simply sort of in a different form. For me, I'm just using the pragmatic, so that there does seem to be a distinction, and that the relationship sort of between, particularly the relationship between philosophy as defined by Heidegger, whether it is entirely across both fields, phenomenological or is phenomenological in one register and not in a later register, something very interesting is going on. First of all, it seems to me that Heidegger's discourse in Being and Time is clearly an apocalyptic discourse. That is, that the way sort of in which sort of he is going to deal with Christianity is that he's going to have an apocalyptic register, which he finds an analog in Christianity. Judith Wolff would kind of indicate what kind of analogs that he would sort of find in Christianity. But then, so what he does is he purloins that eschatological, hyper-eschatological register and says it can only be found in philosophy. But of course, what he has done sort of is, and what Kierkegaard has done before him with good conscience, he does with bad conscience, that the future sort of comes in sort of to the text, only in fact sort of as the fruit of the purloining, but it comes through as if it's rebranded sort of as only philosophy can deal with the future, and the radical future, that is the future that is not extrapolatable from the present and not extrapolatable from the past. So the being in time, roughly we use that sort of as our synecdoche. The being in time, Heidegger is apocalyptic sort of in a particular register, whereby sort of that we're talking about, in an odd kind of way, an apocalyptic correlative we'd find in Harnack, precisely the kind of liberal sort of Protestant theologian that he would most despise. So that's phase one. There we've got an apocalyptic bind in this instance, insofar sort of as Heidegger has both used and abused or misused Christian apocalyptic / eschatology, disowned it, and then rebranded a version of it sort of for sort of his own philosophy. If we think about the Kara, whether we think about it sort of it's starting in 33, sort of, or maybe even earlier, but let's say approximately sort of there. Clearly sort of that, at least in terms of literary form, the text seemed to have changed entirely. So whether or not so we can kind of give an argument that there is continuity, and I'm open to the argument that there is continuity, but clearly sort of in terms of literary form and shape, we're now sort of involved sort of not merely in the prospect of hermeneutics, right, the prospect of understanding and interpreting. What he's doing sort of is he's substituted interpreting text sort of for sort of how you do philosophy, and sort of he's interpolated literary texts as sort of text to be interpreted. I'm thinking of Hölderlin in particular. If we look sort of at those texts, and of course to the side we have to look at the relationship between him and Hölderlin, but also a relationship between him and Nietzsche. It seems self-evident to me, that we're talking now about an apocalyptic discourse that has another specification than the one that we just talked about. Now the apocalyptic discourse is a discourse of event or ereignis, which gets encapsulated in odd mythic categories, which themselves he produces, adduces, and then he demythologizes his own mythology. And he does it sort of with a view that previously there probably is the anxiety as to whether apocalyptic is Christian or not. In this manifold, one has to say that there's an insistence that apocalyptic, while sort of functionally transcendent, that is, it functions interruptively, it functions eventfully, it functions as a happening, it functions sort of as a tear. Nonetheless, he doesn't want to allow any prospect that tear sort of could be filled with Jewish or Christian content. And therefore, sort of the way in which sort of he surrounds the apocalyptic event is that we've got sort of the fourfold. We've got the immortal and the mortal. We've got the divine and the human. We've got the sky and the earth. All kinds of kind of mythology sort of that he himself sort of is going to then do an active translation. The one thing we do know is that this functions to prevent a Christian interpretation and or, from my point of view, a Christian assimilation of Heidegger. So that he has built into the being in time, what he's done is he has a number of preventions within the discourse to say, well, you can function at the ontic level, that would be Christianity. I'm functioning at the ontological level. In other words, level analysis functions as the inhibition with respect to confounding a philosophical discourse and a philosophical apocalyptic with a Christian apocalyptic. More radically, however, in the later work, he does in fact provide an interpretation. And the function of the interpretation is to foreclose the prospect that we could ever confound rightness with the Christian God or the Jewish God. So what I see then is the double bind is, and the double bind, of course, is that someone, a Christian philosopher who is, or a theologian who's interested in appropriating Heidegger. You've got to do so, there's no with, in being entitled the first preventative. Now, that preventative in the scholarship can be regarded as hard or soft. That is that one can argue that what Heidegger does sort of is he does a reduction sort of to experience, and of course you could come back sort of and recalibrate categorially sort of what the experience is. And if you're prepared sort of, if you're doing theology, to move back so that sort of particular sort of more primal level, then it may very well be so that there isn't going to be a massive amount of critique sort of your symbols and so forth. And that would have been sort of the way in which Karl Rahner sort of would have viewed sort of what Heidegger has done. It's certainly the way sort of any number of Protestant Catholic theologians who turn out to be apologists for Heidegger so had tended to think about it. That is, they have stipulated what he himself stipulates. This is methodological atheism and not atheism per se. It seems to me that the text itself, that is, if that's found in introduction sort of as telling you sort of what he's doing, and to some extent sort of preempting sort of certain kind of criticism, the text itself says otherwise. The text itself is not simply methodologically atheistic. I think it's materially, categorically atheistic. In other words, there's nothing in the text that allows you to substitute God for death, for instance. So God is not the happening. Death is the happening. Death is a substitute happening sort of for God. So my view is that's not a particular out. In the second case, that is now on the other side of the carrot, we have to deal sort of with Heidegger's regression to Hölderlin, which is itself a regression to Greece, which itself is a regression to ancient Greece, which is a regression sort of to a time sort of that none of us know, in which sort of we are sort of to some extent doing a phenomenology of religion, kind of almost a la Mercier-Eliade, sort of in terms of height and depth and so forth. So we've got sort of this particular construction, but now this construction is not purely descriptive, it's explanatory. That is, it is intended sort of to shape that transcendence, sort of any form of transcendence as the transcendent is ruled out. But it's not just that. That's sort of, shall we say, Heidegger's talking about ontology. But any form of transcendence which gives you any sort of kind of maximal degree of verticality is ruled out. In other words, transcendence has to be sort of within. Transcendence can be a bulge in the order of immanence, but it cannot break it. So what I want to do is I want to suggest that theologians and Christian philosophers are going to have a very, very, very difficult time assimilating whole cloth either of those Heideggers, whether we want to split him in a Heidegger 1, Heidegger 2, or whether we want to say there's Heidegger across these manifolds. But one thing in particular, sort of I would want to add. So that's, I think, sort of the general thing that I want to say. That is, I want to make the argument, not to say that Heidegger can't be assimilated in some limited respects, but Heidegger cannot be assimilated qua Heidegger. He can't Christianly be assimilated qua Heidegger. So that's the major claim. The second claim, as a derivative one, but it is the one solution that sort of I'm going to itemize this time around, is that I want to raise the question then sort of about tradition. So in other words, I've made a judgment with respect to whether he can or cannot be assimilated. But then sort of I want to ask the question, whether as a function of that, whether we might talk about, well, I'm saying a Catholic tradition cannot assimilate this particular person, Heidegger, this particular religious thinker. But I also want to ask the question, when we sort of Christians, and certainly when we Catholics talk about tradition and we talk about assimilation, clearly there is an event quality with respect to the great texts of our tradition. But of course, those great texts are also received texts, which sort of we pass on, hand on, with some degree of confidence that the distance from the source is not going to be such that it accounts absolutely against the event. That is, that we have either misinterpreted it or any interpretation is necessarily going to be a reduction. So whatever degree of discontinuity we allow, and surely we should, I think, allow for some elements of discontinuity, there is a sense in which, even when we don't have a notion of a deposit or a thing or a fact that simply gets reproduced over time, we are, I think, persuaded that there's some continuity in our tradition, and that the tradition itself is not simply a cover term with respect to primal episodes of tear in the fabric of our common consciousness. So I think I'd want to stipulate that as a very rough and ready account of what a Catholic tradition would look like. The question then I'll ask within the two constellations of Heidegger, the early and the late, is whether or not you can have a notion of tradition which allows any form of continuity whatsoever. In other words, that we only have fracture, we only have division, and that once we get to the later Heidegger notion of arigness, it does seem to suggest that we only actually have an event, and that the event itself is in principle unassimilatable. Now that actually turns out to be very interesting. It turns out to be very interesting in light of the fact that Gadamer is the first receiver of Heidegger, and the first receiver of Heidegger on tradition. Gadamer has traditionally been a friend, at least looked on as a friend, with respect to Catholics who are interested in notions of tradition, who want some discontinuity, but also want to measure a continuity, and who themselves have been reacting against a kind of neo-Thomist view of tradition as a thing that's reproduced. Well, I think this raises a very interesting question as to whether Gadamer, who has cobbled together his interpretation theory on being in time in terms of understanding and interpretation, and then later on with respect to the notion of language, and language being the house of being, but also language as a language event. It raises the question as to whether or not we're have been led astray by Gadamer. That is, that whether we think that whether we've been either deluded into thinking that Gadamer actually represents Heidegger, or that's one option. Option two is he does represent Heidegger, but it doesn't look as if he's representing Heidegger, and that his view of our encounter with the text is a view of an encounter with something that, by the nature of the case in our reading, is unassimilatable ultimately. So it's not just simply that it puts a check on our horizon and disturbs our horizon, but essentially, so speaking, its function is to disturb our horizon, but its function is not to reorient or to recalibrate that particular horizon. So either Gadamer is a domestication, in which we haven't been dealing with Heidegger, and perhaps now it's an insinuation that we can't deal with Heidegger, or to an extent to which he's covered over Heidegger by a kind of normalizing process, and by superimposing on Heidegger what Heidegger would refuse to get superimposed. That is, that what Gadamer does is, it seems to me, in terms of history of philosophy in particular, is that he seems to put back into play all those philosophers whom Heidegger has taken out of play. So Hegel is back in play. It's the case that Plato is back in play, and that somehow or other, a history of philosophy, a history of the great philosophers, is possible when Heidegger has indicated to you, and it's possible because perhaps it's the case that Gadamer is in the tradition of a kind of historicist-like kind of form of intellectual history, of which we would find Dilthey, the template, and that he brings together two things that Heidegger simply thinks cannot be brought together. That is, philosophy in the pure and proper sense, which is unexpurgated, unassimilatable event, intellectual history, which allows us to slip over sort of what Heidegger is apocalyptically suggesting sort of to us. So when I'm thinking of that, sort of when I'm thinking sort of that we have to, I think, question again, so what is the relationship between Gadamer, who is, I think, one of the mediating forces between Catholic thought and Heidegger, whether or not sort of he allows us a bridge, or whether he's a pontoon of some sort or other. And I would want to say sort of that he is not the bridge we thought he could be. But I'm also thinking sort of the Davos debate, which, as you know, Shivara sort of was at, and the way in which Heidegger treated, what was then sort of the great cultural historian in Germany, Cyril. And the way sort of he treated him was that he didn't talk to him because he had already sort of had constructed Cyril as a very learned man, and by definition, not a philosopher. Because a very learned man sort of can talk eloquently about the relationship between a particular discourse and the prior discourses. And the talking of the relation between discourses is always going to favor a continuity. Whereas his insistence was that discourses, real philosophical discourses are unassimilatable, and we have no cultural history of philosophy. So essentially, even when Heidegger is doing his so-called history of philosophy, he is actually refusing to do history of philosophy. My suspicion sort of is that the way to think about the relationship between Gadamer and Heidegger with respect sort of to the prospects of tradition, therefore the prospects with respect to Catholic assimilation, is to go back to the Davos debate, and to some extent, anachronistically substitute Gadamer for Cyril. I think we come out sort of with a fairly bleak conclusion with respect to the prospect of assimilation. That's essentially, I think, what I'm talking about.
Well, Cyril, you were ever the master hermeneut. This is an utterly fascinating topic, certainly in a rather boring fashion, I would say. I would agree with what you say. So, but we're running a bit late. But I will just ask one question. I could ask 1,000 questions, and so you'll have to be prepared when you're here at the end of April for the 1,000 questions. But insofar as you were saying that Heidegger qua Heidegger cannot be assimilated by Catholic discourse, you would be in no doubt the minority, I think, of Catholic intellectuals. But there's only 3 other thinkers at the top of my head that I can think of that would also say something similar, although not on the different levels of interpretive sophistication that you've laid out. Namely, Shivara would say that Heidegger cannot be taken on board qua Heidegger. René Girard would say he cannot be taken on board because he's seeking to reinstitute the sacred. It's seen, for example, in his Nietzsche volumes, that he dismisses the antithesis between Christ and Dionysus as very unfortunate to Nietzsche's thought, and he submerges it and then only concentrate on the history of being. Another thinker would be contemporary, namely William Desmond. How, very, very briefly, Cyril, how would you situate your response in relation to those 3? Would you even see it as being in line? Am I correct in seeing that lineage, or?
Oh, I think sort of it's pretty much totally in line, actually, with all 3. In other words, that I myself actually have written on Girard and Heidegger, so I'm going to take that box off. And that's an interesting one, because that discussion and that division is a division between Girard's form of apocalyptic Christianity and another form of apocalyptic. So that can be ticked off. Shivara, I think, can be ticked off because I think he also saw that when we're talking about Heidegger, we're talking sort of about sort of I mean, it's mixed. On the one hand, you could think about sort of that Heidegger sort of is a form of descendants. On the other hand, you could think so that Heidegger sort of is a form of theopanism, whereby sort of we actually have something outside, not otherwise specifiable, which interrupts and so forth. So I think that seems to me that I can sort of tick that off as well. which is not to say that is precisely behind what I say, but I've read Shivara, and I think I would confirm his diagnosis. And I think the same thing with William Desmond as well. William has, being in a different way, in a different discourse, has been going down both lines, genealogical lines that I go down. On the one hand, it's against Heidegger, and the other hand is against Hegel. And probably he has a third hand, which I think turns out to be kind of one version of Heidegger. That is, Desmond is also against Nietzsche and the post-Nietzscheans. When I go against Heidegger, I'm also including the Nietzscheans and post-Nietzscheans in terms one begetting and the other kind of following. But I would say that yes, I would say all of the above are companions, and I actually don't have anything whereby I would say that I prefer one to the other. What I would add to that is that this is not entirely, and I think you didn't get it wrong, this is not entirely a prescription of engagement with Heidegger, no more than I want prescription of engagement with Hegel. But you got to actually figure out what you can and cannot expect. I would say that Christian theologians and Christian philosophers should actually say a very loud mea culpa with respect to the way in which they have dealt with their own tradition. And the only reason that Heidegger persists, it seems to me as a resource, is simply by the way in which we have ended up in our own particular cul-de-sacs and have not found a way out of it. So I, oddly enough, regard Heidegger as a set of memorial set pieces for us. That is, that being in time is a memorial set piece, with respect to our passingness, our evanescence, with respect to our death and with respect to our future. I would say the Heidegger Out of the Cares is a kind of reminiscence or a set of reminders with respect to that there are events, clearly including the Christian event which he would prescribe, but there are events which challenge and which disrupt us. There are events which allow us to belong. There are events which release us. And of course, we have Christian sources for all of the above. With respect to the last one, we have Meister Eckhart. But of course, we do our Meister Eckhart now via Heidegger because we forgot him, or even more importantly, we forgot all Rhineland mysticism, in which we have more sober versions of Gelassenheit than we find in Meister Eckhart. And of course, that's the only version that Heidegger would take. To the degree to which we forget our tradition, we end up being impoverished. We're anorexic with respect to our resources. And we find something that's a lookalike, a simulacrum at hand. Whereas the tradition itself, to the degree to which we allow it to be polyphonic and not one thing, provides us with all the richness we need to be endorsed by the past, or at least to be enabled by the past, and at the same time try to conjugate out of what we have a possible future. So he turns out to be a memorial thinker who's anti-Christian, who is we were not as needy Christianly as we turn out to be, and not knowing our tradition as well as we ought to. We need him to remind us of things which are vaguely Christian, which in turn might intimate the Christian things that we've forgotten. So it is not to be cut off all negotiation. We can invite him, and he will turn out to be, and we have to know beforehand, an entirely unruly guest.
Cyril, as always, it's a deep pleasure to converse with you. We look forward with immense joy and anticipation, inviting you and welcoming you to our conference here at the Pontifical University of St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, at the end of April. And it will be an absolute pleasure. And I thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you again.
Thank you, Cyril. See you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.